The camp was a place built to break you. Dust clung to every boot, every sleeve, every face. The heat beat down without mercy, and the drills carved lines of exhaustion into even the toughest recruits. It was a place where shouting voices ruled the air, where rifles cracked through the valley, where failure meant running laps until your lungs burned. Amid all of that chaos, Elena Ward moved like a shadow nobody bothered to look at twice. She wasn't in formation. She wasn't firing at targets. She wasn't wearing stripes on her shoulder. She was the nurse. 35 years old, shoulders straight, eyes calm. She didn't stride the camp with the swagger of an officer or the desperation of a recruit. She slipped between barracks and infirmary, clipboard in one hand, bandages in the other, quiet as the dust that curled in the air. To the young soldiers sweating through their first real taste of military life, she was background, furniture, necessary but unimportant, a safety net for weak ankles and bloody noses, nothing more. Her uniform was plain, sleeves rolled neatly, hair pulled into a tight bun that never seemed to loosen. The only thing that stood out about her were her hands, small, steady, always clean, always deliberate. She checked vitals with the same calm she'd used to pour a glass of water. She pressed gauze to wounds without flinching at blood. She wrote notes in a looping, precise script that none of the recruits ever bothered to read. By the second week, the nickname had already spread. Florence Nightingale. It wasn't said with admiration. It was muttered under breath, called out in the mess hall, whispered with a curl of laughter. Not the real Nightingale who had saved lives and built hospitals, but the cartoon they imagined, a fragile woman with a lantern, too soft for a place like this. She wouldn't last a day outside the infirmary, one recruit snorted as Elena walked past, her tray of supplies balanced neatly on her arm. Probably faints at the sight of real blood, another chimed in, their voices loud enough to carry. Elena didn't blink, didn't slow. She set the tray down, unwrapped a roll of bandages, and began wrapping a sprained wrist with quiet efficiency. The soldier whose arm she worked on shifted, uncomfortable not because of the injury but because she didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge the noise behind her. The jokes grew sharper with repetition. Recruits lined up at the infirmary door and tossed out barbs like they were testing her skin for cracks. Florence, got any bedtime stories? Florence, maybe sing us a lullaby. Florence, you ever patch up a real soldier? She never looked up from her work. Just tied knots in bandages, wiped down her tools, and dropped used swabs into the waste bin with the same calm rhythm. Her silence unnerved them more than any outburst would have. Some swore she didn't even hear them, but others noticed the way her pen moved faster across her clipboard when the laughter rose, how she washed her hands longer at the basin after a particularly cruel remark. At night, when the barracks echoed with tired groans and muffled laughter, recruits compared bruises like trophies. Elena was never part of those conversations. She was in the infirmary, inventorying supplies, her small lamp throwing a dim circle of light over neat rows of antiseptic bottles and gauze. She hummed sometimes, just barely, a sound so faint you could mistake it for the buzzing of the lamp itself. No one asked where she came from. No one thought to. To them, she was the camp nurse, just a nurse, tucked away in a corner of their world that didn't matter. But if anyone had watched more closely, if anyone had noticed the way she scanned the horizon during morning runs, the way her eyes lingered a second too long on the watchtower's shadow, they might have wondered why she seemed to know more about the rhythm of the camp than the recruits sweating through it. But they didn't. They laughed, they joked, and they carried on. Elena Ward kept her silence, her hands steady, her notes neat. She was only the camp nurse. And nobody believed she was anything else. The mess hall at night was louder than it had any right to be. Tin trays clattered, chairs scraped across the concrete floor, and voices carried in sharp bursts over the hum of the overhead lamps. It was where recruits blew off the steam they'd held in all day, a place where exhaustion and bravado mixed into something close to cruelty. Elena sat at her usual spot, the far corner by the window, her tray pushed aside and her clipboard open. She wrote in silence, her pencil moving quick and steady, the curve of her script sharp under the flicker of the bulbs. Across the room, laughter rose. A group of recruits leaned close at their table, the sound of their voices pulling attention whether they meant it to or not. "She's not even qualified," one said, his fork stabbing into a heap of potatoes. "Bet you anything she got this gig because she's related to somebody up top. Some general's niece or cousin. Connections, not merit." "Come on, she's a nurse, isn't she?" another asked, but his tone was mocking, not defensive. "You seen her do anything but hand out aspirin and band-aids? Probably just has some fancy paper saying she's qualified." "Or maybe not even that," a third chimed in. "Wouldn't surprise me if she's just first, aid certified, CPR and a nice smile, and here she is, a camp ornament." Their laughter sharpened, carrying across the room. Elena didn't lift her head. She turned a page, her pencil scratching against the paper, as though she were writing about something far removed from their voices. Still, her hand paused for a fraction of a second when someone added, "If there's a real emergency, she'll freeze. Mark my words." The words stuck in the air long after the laughter faded, like smoke that refused to clear. 2 days later, an emergency came. The drill had been routine enough, a timed sprint across the obstacle course, recruits vaulting walls, crawling under barbed wire, carrying heavy packs in the dry, blinding heat. Elena stood at her usual station, a folding table at the edge of the course stocked with water and gauze. Most of the time she treated scraped palms or shallow cuts from wire, nothing that couldn't be brushed off. But when one of the recruits, a wiry boy barely out of school, came down wrong on a jump, the sound was different. A snap, sharp and ugly, followed by a scream that cut across the field. The instructors shouted for order. Recruits froze, some wincing, some turning away. Elena was already moving. She didn't run, didn't stumble. She walked fast and direct, her bag already open before she reached him. The boy was writhing in the dirt, his leg bent wrong at the shin, the bone threatening to break the skin. His friends hovered helpless, their panic useless in the face of real pain. Elena dropped to her knees beside him, her face calm. She pressed 2 fingers to his pulse, her eyes steady, then spoke in a low, firm voice no one had ever heard from her before. "Breathe. Look at me. Stay still." The recruits stumbled back, making space. Elena pulled a splint from her bag, her hands moving so fast and precise it seemed she'd done it 100 times before. In one smooth motion, she straightened the leg, braced it, and wrapped it tight. The boy's cries softened to ragged gasps, his eyes wide with shock. Elena never wavered. She tied the last knot with perfect tension, then signaled for the stretcher team. Instructor Vargas, who'd been barking orders moments before, had gone silent. He stood a few paces away, his limp making him lean heavier on his cane than usual, his sharp eyes fixed on her hands. Something flickered in his expression, not surprise at her skill but recognition. Like he'd seen movements like that before, long ago, in a place where precision wasn't optional but survival. When the stretcher team carried the boy off, Elena stayed behind, kneeling in the dirt for a long moment as though she were making sure the earth itself held steady again. Then she rose, brushed the dust from her uniform, and walked back to her table. No celebration. No explanation. Just silence. The recruits who had laughed about her 2 nights before avoided her eyes now. Their whispers followed her, lower than before, laced not with amusement, but with unease. She wasn't just a nurse with soft hands and neat notes. The way she moved, the way she worked under pressure, it wasn't training camp skill. It was something else. Vargas watched her all the way back to the infirmary. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tight, like a man turning over a secret he wasn't ready to say out loud. Elena washed her hands at the basin, methodical as always, the water turning pink before it ran clear. She dried them slowly, folded the towel, and set it aside. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. but her silence had shifted. It no longer felt like avoidance. It felt like weight, as though behind that silence was a story no one dared to ask about. The night was supposed to be quiet. The barracks had finally gone still after hours of restless shifting. The mess hall lights had been dimmed, and the wind carried only the dry rattle of dust against the metal siding. Elena Ward sat alone in the infirmary, the lamp above her desk humming faintly, its pale light falling across a row of neatly labeled bottles. She was updating supply logs, her pen moving with steady strokes, when the siren split the silence. The sound was jarring, sharp, a warning no one at camp ever wanted to hear. Within seconds, boots hit the ground outside, shouting voices cut through the darkness, and the distant clatter of weapons echoed from the armory. Recruits stumbled out of their bunks, some grabbing rifles with shaky hands, others freezing in place like prey caught in a floodlight. Panic rippled fast. The instructor's orders barked through the night, but chaos had already taken root. Elena set her pen down. Her face didn't change. She stood, adjusted the sleeves of her uniform, and turned off the lamp. The door to the infirmary burst open with a violent crack. A man in dark clothes stormed inside, weapon raised, eyes wild. He wasn't one of theirs. His movements were too frantic, his stance sloppy but dangerous in its desperation. The barrel of his rifle swept across the room until it found her, alone. For a split second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Any other nurse, any ordinary staff member, might have screamed, begged, or tried to hide. Elena didn't. She moved. Not fast, not flinching, just with the kind of certainty that made every action seem already decided. The intruder shouted something, words half lost in the ringing of alarms, but Elena didn't pause to listen. She stepped in, closing the distance with startling calm. Her hand slid to the weapon, twisting it away from her body before the man could even react. A sharp shift of her weight brought her elbow up under his arm, locking his joint. He grunted in shock, his strength faltering under the sudden leverage. Her eyes didn't flicker. Her movements didn't stutter. In one fluid sweep, she shifted her stance, dropped low, and pulled. The man's balance broke. His body hit the ground with a heavy, final thud. The rifle clattered out of his hands, sliding across the infirmary floor. Elena pressed her knee into his chest, her grip unshaken as she held him pinned, his arm twisted in a lock that dared him to resist. The door burst open again. Recruits flooded in, rifles raised, their faces pale, their breathing ragged. They froze where they stood. What they saw wasn't panic. It wasn't fear. It was Elena Ward, the woman they had mocked as Florence Nightingale, holding down an armed intruder with the efficiency of someone who had done it before. The silence that followed was thick, almost unbearable. The sirens still screamed outside, but inside the infirmary the sound felt muffled, distant. None of the recruits fired. None of them even moved. Their eyes were wide, jaws slack, as if the ground had shifted beneath them and they hadn't caught up yet. Elena glanced up only once, her expression calm, her breath steady. Her voice, when it came, was low and precise. "Secure him." It was all she said. Then she stood, brushed the dust from her hands, and stepped back as if she'd merely finished a routine task. The recruits exchanged stunned looks, their weapons still raised but useless now, their training undone by the fact that the nurse, the one they never considered a soldier, had already ended the fight before it began. The intruder groaned on the floor, defeated, disarmed, and bound in silence. The recruits didn't laugh this time. They didn't call her names. They just stared, their breaths caught somewhere between disbelief and the first taste of fear. For the first time since camp began, Elena Ward wasn't background. She wasn't a figure at the edge of the field with bandages and notes. She was something else entirely, something none of them had words for. The infirmary smelled of sweat and cordite. The intruder lay on the floor, wrists bound with rough cord, his weapon secured by instructors who had finally arrived after the commotion had already ended. The sirens still wailed, though their urgency felt out of place now. The threat was over, finished before it had really begun. Soldiers crowded the doorway, rifles loose in their hands, eyes darting between the subdued man on the ground and the woman standing over him. Elena Ward didn't move like someone who had just wrestled down an armed intruder. She moved like someone who had finished tying a bandage. Calm, unhurried, methodical. She slipped her gloves back on, tugging the fabric tight over her fingers, then crouched once more beside the man, pressing 2 fingers to his throat. His pulse was strong, steady, alive. She nodded once to herself, then stood. The whispers started immediately, sharp and hushed. How did she do that? She's a nurse, she's just. No, that wasn't normal. Did you see that? That wasn't luck. The instructors avoided each other's eyes. Even the ones who'd been shouting orders seconds before looked unsettled. It wasn't only what Elena had done, but the way she had done it. No fear, no hesitation. Every move precise, stripped of wasted effort. It hadn't looked like improvisation, it had looked like memory. The sound of boots striking gravel cut through the murmur. Major Reynolds pushed into the room, his broad frame filling the doorway, his graying hair slicked back with sweat. His gaze swept the scene once, taking in the bound intruder, the wide-eyed recruits, the instructors frozen in place. Then his eyes landed on Elena. Something in his face changed. Color drained, jaw tightened. He stepped closer, his voice low, half to himself, half to the silence hanging in the room. Unit 9, Ghost Viper. I thought they were gone. The words seemed to suck the air from the room. Every recruit who had mocked her, every soldier who had laughed at the nickname, went still. Ghost Viper was more rumor than reality. The kind of name whispered in barracks, dismissed as myth, a ghost story about missions nobody wanted to believe were true. If the major was right, then the quiet nurse they had written off as useless was something else entirely, something that belonged to the shadows. Elena didn't respond. She adjusted her sleeves, checked once more that her gloves were secure, and stepped past the intruder. She didn't look at the recruits, though they parted instinctively, clearing her path like water around stone. She walked to the door, her boots slow and deliberate, then paused just long enough to let her words fall into the silence. Get back to training, you'll need it. Her voice wasn't raised, it didn't have to be, it cut sharper for its quiet steadiness. Reynolds stared after her, his lips pressed thin, eyes heavy with something that looked like respect, edged with unease. The recruits stayed frozen, their rifles hanging limp, their earlier arrogance drowned out by the image of the nurse who had brought down an armed man without so much as breaking her breath. By morning, the story had already grown. Whispers passed from barrack to barrack, stretching the truth but never straying far from it. Florence Nightingale wasn't a joke anymore. She was Ghost Viper. Unit 9, a name none of them had expected to hear, much less see standing in the infirmary with bandages on her desk and secrets stitched into her silence. The legend began that night. The camp nurse who wasn't supposed to fight, who wasn't supposed to be anyone at all, but she had been forged for war long before any of them ever arrived, and now they knew.